Um, Thanks for joining today. So the talk is about the cost of energy, specifically electricity in the UK, and how net zero relates to that cost. Just briefly, I'll introduce myself and I'll introduce our company, Discerner. I'm Phil Norval. My job title is Head of Group for Energy Efficiency in the Built Environment. I've been working for, about 15 years in this sector, 6 and a bit years now in Discerner. And a lot of the work I've been doing here involves providing mainly businesses, specifically SMEs, with support around things like energy efficiency, so carrying out energy audits, developing decarbonisation plans, helping businesses work towards net zero, and coming up with solutions and helping in the implementation of some of those solutions for them to save energy and reduce carbon emissions. Discerner itself covers quite a broad range of topics within the net zero and decarbonisation sector. There's 4 broad areas that we operate in. So we have a group that works within the utility scale renewables and storage, helping businesses to connect to the grid, but also helping to develop grid scale solar PV, wind and battery storage projects. We also deliver field trials of various smart technologies. So very often there are smart solutions, internet-based solutions for equipment that uses energy, and it can be, and collectively those kind of solutions can help individual households save energy, but they can also combine to provide quite a useful resource for the grid. So we've trialed various different systems and devices to that end over the years, and that's actually delivered by the team that I'm leading. But most of our time is spent delivering support across net zero within the built environment. So that includes the things that I've just described that I do, as well as carbon footprinting, helping businesses look at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and finding ways for them to reduce those emissions and set targets for net zero. And then the other team within our company delivers life cycle assessment expertise. That includes things like environmental product declarations, advising on things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU and soon to be the UK has implemented. Anything involving products and processes and their broad environmental and social impact, which is a very specialist area, and we've got sort of internationally recognised expertise in that field. I mentioned that we carry out some carbon footprinting, and that's based on our Bring About platform, which is a web-based application that is really geared towards small businesses who want to understand their carbon emissions. So it's like I say, it's a web-based tool which is designed to be as user-friendly as possible whilst adhering to all of the ins and outs of the greenhouse gas protocol. So it's simplifying a very complex area, and we're sort of on hand as consultants to support businesses in that effort as well. If you've got any questions about any of the services we provide, please do get in touch or ask a question later on, and be happy to talk about that further. So the subject today, it's a big one in the UK, and especially in the sort of industrial sector, manufacturing. Many businesses and business owners have been crying out for help and to share their pain around the cost of energy, specifically electricity, because it is so high. And so we want to address what's causing that, how we compare to other countries within Europe and across the rest of the world, and look at all the different factors that from various corners in the media, in politics and business, at one time or another they get blamed as the cause for the high energy costs. So we're going to look at a few of those and see where we think the main cause might lie. And then going beyond that, we might come up with some practical measures that could be implemented across the UK to try and mitigate the high costs that we currently have. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, this is a graph of all of the countries within the IEA, the International Energy Agency. So there's 28 member countries, and the bold, bright red line represents the UK. And you can see 20 years ago we were somewhere in the middle, but since then our electricity cost has just skyrocketed, and to the point where over the last couple of years we have been fairly consistently the highest priced electricity country in all of those 28 countries. So we're 46% above the median of those 28 countries' electricity price averages, and that electricity price has kind of gone hand in hand with fairly marked declines in our energy intensive industrial output. So things like metals production and heavy manufacturing, they've seen really sharp declines over the years, and a big factor in that is the cost of the energy. And so it's to the point where, compared to some countries in Europe, where businesses are paying almost twice what their counterparts in France are paying for electricity at the moment. And it's not just the absolute price, it's the rate at which the price has increased. So businesses just haven't been able to adjust to those changes quickly enough. So I don't think there's any arguing that we have a serious problem. But at the same time as those price increases, I've got a graph here showing the different energy sources that we rely on for our electricity. And that includes various types of renewable energy as well as traditional sources like coal, gas, and nuclear. And you can see that the yellow line, that's solar, that's dropped very quickly in the earlier 2000s, and it's still dropping now to the point where it's amongst the lowest priced sources of electricity. And the same is true for onshore wind and offshore wind, which has dropped more recently, but they're all now down around the same sort of price per megawatt hour, whereas the likes of gas, nuclear, they've gone up in price, and coal has been entirely phased out now. So these high energy prices, there's all of these different factors. I don't know what people think, if you've got an opinion on what the main cause might be behind our high electricity costs, but we very often see net zero and the various green levies that are added to our electricity bills. We've seen those being blamed across lots of sources as being the major reason why we're paying so much. But there are other factors cited. So the war in Ukraine is another one, because we have historically relied on lots of gas being imported through the Ukraine from Russia. Also, the growth of renewables has been really quite dramatic over recent years, and they are intermittent sources. So it's not always sunny, it's not always windy. Something has to compensate. Either other sources of energy or lots and lots of batteries need to be installed to level out that output. And so renewables themselves quite often get some of the blame, and those renewables are often even when they're generating, they're quite often forced to shut down when either there isn't the demand at that time or the grid just isn't capable of handling the loads that they're trying to deliver. So there's quite a few things that do get do get the blame from different quarters, but we need to look a bit deeper, I think, to see what the causes might be. Just briefly, we're talking about electricity prices, but there's quite a lot of complexity within that. There's various different components of what an end user ends up paying for their electricity. The actual generation of that electricity itself, it's only really forming 40 to 45% of the overall cost that an end user pays. There are various different additional charges in there because that energy has to get from its power station or from its source, wind turbine, solar farm, or wherever, to the end user. And so there's a lot of infrastructure, distribution and transmission infrastructure, as well as systems and equipment to help balance all the loads across the grid. So there's charges on people's bills to cover those costs. And then there's various policies from the government, some of which you might put down to environmental priorities, to things like net zero, for example, or other policies that try and encourage the development of lower carbon energy sources. And you can see some of the factors within that category. And then there are other operating costs on top of that to just keep everything running properly. And then of course there's VAT, which many businesses do claim back at the end of the day. But ultimately, as you can see in the pie chart, the actual wholesale electricity cost, it's not quite half of the overall cost, and then everything else contributes a little over half, with those environmental charges making up just less than a quarter of the overall cost, about 23%. So we'll jump straight into the one that the main blame, the main factor that gets blamed in some sectors of the media, which is net zero. There's a lot of politicians shouting about net zero and how we need to kill the whole idea because it's crippling the economy. But in terms of energy cost, it's worth looking at this critically just to see how much that might be to blame. So as I mentioned in a slide or two ago, there are a set of so-called green levies that the government impose on top of electricity costs. And most of them are there to encourage the development of renewables. Things like renewables obligation and contracts for difference, they are there to encourage the large-scale deployment of renewables by generators. And then feed-in tariffs and climate change levy, they end up getting added to the bottom of people's bills to account for those incentive schemes and efforts to mitigate climate change and develop a domestic renewables market. So as a share of the whole, like I say, those green levies are about 23% of the overall cost. They're not the biggest factor in an electricity bill. The wholesale cost of generating the electricity in the first place is still the number one factor. It's not 50%, but it's not far off. So it's not fair to say that net zero itself is the main factor. It is certainly a factor, but as we'll see, I think it's not purely a negative when it comes to the effect that those policies have on bills. And then within the wholesale market, these levies are almost entirely, I think 100%, applied to the cost of electricity, not gas, for some reason. So rather than encouraging the electrification of things like heat and decarbonisation of the electricity grid, it's actually working counter to any of those ambitions, because those levies are entirely on electricity, not on the fossil fuel. So it's actually discouraging electrification rather than encouraging it. Some people blame what are called contracts for difference, which is the mechanism by which large-scale renewables projects are incentivized to bid for contracts to supply the grid with electricity. As you can see in some of these numbers, the prices that get agreed are around £50 per megawatt hour for offshore and onshore wind and solar, whereas the current, I should just say that the way these contracts for differences work is that they guarantee the prospective generators that if the wholesale price falls below a certain level, they will get compensated. But on the opposite side, if the wholesale price goes above the price that they've been guaranteed, the generator has to pay extra to the government. So currently, the wholesale price is around 100 to 150 pounds per megawatt hour, and the rate that they were guaranteed was around 50 pounds, which means that they're actually paying extra for that generation. So the contracts for difference at the moment, over the last couple of years, have actually effectively been reducing bills because it's the grid and ultimately the end user that is benefiting from that system rather than the generators. Another thing that's cited is the fact that net zero requires all of these upgrades to the grid, lots of investment which somebody has to pay for, and so therefore it ultimately falls to the consumers to pay for all of the costs of all these infrastructure upgrades. I don't think, however, it's not really fair to say that that's all because of net zero and renewables. A lot of the electricity grid in the UK is very old and tired. So upgrades are needed and will continue to be needed. And like much of the large-scale infrastructure in the UK, it's seen decades of underinvestment. So even if we were sticking with gas, and if we hadn't got rid of coal, we would still need to upgrade and replace lots of equipment across the grid. And so it's not fair to say that renewables and net zero are the reason for those costs. It might look different to how it would have looked if fossil fuels were still leading the way, but you can't get around the investment no matter where the energy is coming from. And also, like I mentioned earlier on, the intermittency of renewables is sometimes blamed because the electricity they generate isn't necessarily available at the time that it's actually needed, meaning you either have to switch off resources, like you have to stop those resources exporting energy to the grid, or you have to store it somehow until it can be used. And so there are a lot of battery storage projects currently installed, but a huge amount in the pipeline. As you can see, there's about 20 gigawatts waiting to be developed by 2030, and I think there's far more at application stage even than that, and that costs a fair bit. So it's the cost of those storage projects adds about 12 to 14 pounds per megawatt hour to people's bills. The government is having to pay various generators £400 million to switch off due to the lack of the unbalanced nature of some of these demands and supply and demand factors. And they do contribute to costs at the end of a bill, but the cost of these storage projects has fallen dramatically. It's falling all the time. It's 70% cheaper for energy storage on the grid than it was just in 2010. It's not, but that's not to say that it's not a factor. However, but it's definitely not the largest factor amongst all of the different elements contributing to our high electricity prices. Another thing that's often cited in the high costs of electricity in the UK are the various international events. Nobody can escape the fact we've had a dramatic few years, nationally and internationally, with unforeseen events, namely COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those are cited very often for anything that's not really gone well in the economy recently. Just to really look at this properly, there's the timeline of these events and what's happened to energy prices is it's quite clear what has happened in some cases, but a bit less clear in other cases. I'll just jump ahead to this graph, which shows some of what's happened recently. So this is going back to 2019, early 2019, showing the gas and electricity prices, wholesale prices this is, rather than end user prices, which don't show quite such dramatic spikes. But you can see that the COVID lockdown didn't immediately result in an increase in costs. It actually resulted in a decrease because lockdown meant that we weren't using as much energy. A lot of factories shut down, and various other activities just stopped for several months. But you can see that did rebound again and started picking up as we came out of lockdown. But as the whole world came out of lockdown and started ramping things back up again, suddenly there was a huge demand for gas in particular. The UK had got rid of a lot of its gas storage in that time, which meant we were exposed to the whims of the international market more than ever before, which is why you see that very, very steep rise. And then this is like a perfect storm, but just after that very steep rise, due to the coming out of lockdown, Russia invaded the Ukraine, which meant the gas taps from Russia were effectively switched off. And then you can see the dramatic ups and downs in the market following that. Things have settled down a lot since then, but we're still looking at gas and electricity prices getting on for twice what they were before COVID, if not or possibly 3 times what they were just around the low point at COVID. So I've shown on that graph that gas and electricity prices follow each other very, very closely, and that might give you a hint as to what I'm working towards when it comes to what to blame for the high electricity costs that we have here. When generators of electricity want to sell their energy to the grid, the market is it works by what's called a marginal pricing mechanism. This is where all electricity providers have a price that they can offer called a marginal cost, which is basically how much it costs to deliver one additional unit of electricity from that particular source. So at any point in time, they all have their price, but to ensure security of supply and to make sure there is enough electricity on the grid, the mechanism, the marginal pricing mechanism, awards or it declares the price based on the highest price in the market. So amongst solar, wind, hydro, wave, gas, nuclear, biomass, they all end up being rewarded with whatever the highest price of those energy sources is. And about 97 or 98% of the time in the UK, that is gas. So despite some of these energy sources effectively having no additional costs to themselves, such as solar or wind, for generating an additional unit of electricity because they have no fuel to buy before they can generate it, they still get rewarded with some of these very, very high prices based on the price of gas. And you can see, again, I've shown this graph again just to show you how things are comparing these days. Gas is by far the highest priced energy source on average, and it's very consistently the highest. So it's gas that is almost all the time that's dictating the cost that we pay, that the wholesale cost of electricity, and the costs of the other forms of energy is effectively irrelevant when it comes to what we're paying as end users. Again, in the media, we're seeing the promise of new gas and oil and coal being dug up out of the ground, either offshore or through fracking and mining in the UK, and it's said that that's going to reduce prices very often, but that simply isn't the case, because whoever is drilling or digging for those fossil fuels, they're not selling it directly to us. They're selling it on the open market, which works internationally, and so the prices they get offered are dictated by averages across the globe, and it's almost entirely detached from what we end up paying and what the wholesale cost of electricity is in the UK, because there's that intermediate international market factor which detaches the cost of those those energy sources from what it actually costs once it's been turned into electricity. And coal, of course, it's almost irrelevant because we don't have any working coal-fired power stations anymore, and it takes a long time and a lot of work and expense to bring those back online or to build new ones. So it's unlikely to come back as a factor in our energy mix, thankfully. Sadly, adding more renewables to the grid, even because of the marginal pricing mechanism that I mentioned, that's not going to immediately have much effect on the costs we pay for electricity, because although it costs them no money effectively in terms of fuel to generate more electricity, they're still getting given the same price that any other power station or energy source is getting. So if gas is setting the price at 100 to 150 pounds per megawatt hour, so is wind, so is solar. They're all getting basically the same. So I just want to jump on to how we can fix the problem. There are a lot of options, some of which have already been tried, some successfully, perhaps some not implemented very effectively, and some options might just be doomed to fail. So one thing that we've tried in the UK is putting a cap on the price of electricity, particularly in the domestic sector. It's covered 29 million households in the UK. The cap's currently about £1,700 per year, and it does keep the prices down temporarily, but then of course, as we know, the prices, the cap keeps changing, keeps raising. It has fallen once or twice, but as with most pricing, it doesn't come down for long. It always trends upwards, and all that is really ultimately doing is subsidizing the cost, and the government is just contributing to people's bills effectively by paying off the suppliers for a portion of that electricity cost. So it's not reducing the wholesale costs. It's basically using taxpayer money to pay for bills rather than forcing or encouraging producers to actually reduce their cost in any way. The price caps have also caused lots of upset in the market. The generators of electricity themselves haven't suffered too much, but the suppliers, so the the organisations that buy energy from the generators and sell them to consumers, many of those failed because they were trying to absorb as much of these as much of the price cap as possible. And in fact, more than 30 energy suppliers collapsed between 2021 and 2022, as many of you may have experienced by losing your electricity suppliers. Of course, this was just something that was implemented across the domestic sector, and there was really no protection for businesses or industry. Other price cap schemes have been tried in other countries. In France, they put a really quite low price cap on the cost of nuclear energy, and it all but destroyed EDF. They virtually went bankrupt as a result. And other sort of equivalent schemes have been tried as well. But like I say, it doesn't actually change how much generators were earning. It's really just that what the money they're getting is subsidised by governments. Another thing that has been tried to some extent in the UK, perhaps not very effectively, is a windfall tax. So when there are big price shocks, and through no sort of virtue or special effort by electricity generators, they end up raking in huge profits. So the war in Ukraine made prices for energy jump up, and even the CEOs, the very high level executives in some of these electricity generating companies they're almost embarrassed at how easy it was for them to make money at the time. And the idea of a windfall tax was introduced because it was deemed to be right and fair that these generators shouldn't benefit from something that they really didn't have any hand in. But almost a bit perverse is that renewable generators that weren't having to buy any gas or coal or any fuel at all, they were making huge profits because their costs didn't go up at all. But because gas was dictating the price of electricity, they were benefiting from these big jumps in price. And of course, the windfall tax didn't necessarily trickle down or work its way through to consumers at all. It went, I think, into sort of general taxation and was used however the government at the time wanted to use it. So it didn't necessarily affect anything to do with the cost we were paying for electricity. Grants and subsidies, again, it's a way of contributing towards the cost of somebody's bill. It doesn't bring down the amount of money that's going to suppliers or generators necessarily. The government introduced a scheme called the British Industry Supercharger last year, which was specifically targeted towards energy intensive industries, so heavy manufacturing, the metals industry, for example. They cut all renewable levies for those businesses, so immediately reduced the cost of electricity for them by around 20%. And it compensated them for some of the network charges as well, which is due to increase up to 90% by next year. And as you can see, the saving as a result of that is around £40 to £50 per megawatt hour, which could be a third to a half of the overall electricity cost, but it's still going to mean, because our electricity costs are so high compared to other countries, it's still barely bringing us down to something like competitive. And it only really benefits around 300 companies in the UK because it's just applied to those very, very high energy users. It doesn't apply to really any SMEs. So 99.8% of businesses in the UK are not benefiting from that scheme. It doesn't address the underlying problems of how electricity prices are dictated in this country. It's again, it's costing the government money, so it's ultimately costing us money as a country. And of course it's favoring some of these very, very large companies. So it's distorting the market in favor of them and against smaller businesses. So there might be room for improvement in schemes like that, but currently it's not necessarily having much of a positive impact to most of the country. Something that that politicians in particular in certain areas are promoting is the idea of just abandoning a net zero altogether, doing away with all of these extra charges on electricity bills, ending the efforts to decarbonize because it's seen as a negative, having a negative effect on our economy. As I said earlier, there is a significant cost on bills of around £55 per megawatt hour, about just short of a quarter of the overall cost of electricity can be deemed to be something like a green levy. If that happened, we would still have the highest electricity costs in Europe, but it's not as simple as that. Obviously, there are lots of benefits from the efforts to decarbonize. One of the biggest ones is that our energy security is constantly improving as long as we're generating electricity with our own renewables resources rather than having to buy gas on the international market. Also, various commodities that are produced using higher carbon energy sources are going to start getting taxed more when they're exported, especially into Europe, due to Europe having the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's rolling out at the moment. So the costs to export will increase because our commodities will be more carbon intensive due to the energy used to produce them. Like I say, so the levies themselves are not really the problem. The market, the marginal pricing mechanism that we're forced to follow in this country is really the biggest factor, as far as I can see. In other words, we're paying what it costs for gas to buy renewable power, and so it's not really the climate ambitions that we have. It's the market and how the market's set up that really is driving the high costs at the moment. The government's consulted on what to do about it. They had what's called the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements that was published. It's being updated about once every 6 months at the moment, but it was the government's white paper on what they're going to do. And they've got various options, but ultimately what they ended up doing was not very much and just letting the market sort itself out. The logic behind that being that renewables are on the rise and gas is the amount of energy. The amount of electricity generated by gas on the grid is slowly reducing as renewables become a larger and larger part. But we don't know that that's necessarily going to have a big impact quickly enough. The ultimate decisions so far have been just to maintain what they're doing currently and not really change anything for at least the next 5 years, by which time we may have an entirely different government. So there's nothing substantial so far been announced by the government. So we'll wait and see if that changes, because obviously governments do change their mind, as we know. So I think a fairly comprehensive approach is needed to deal with our high electricity costs. As I mentioned towards the start, the levies on wholesale electricity costs for renewables and things like that, they're entirely on electricity and not on gas. If that was rebalanced, then it should bring down some of the cost of electricity to the end user, especially when compared to the cost of gas. We need to accelerate the deployment of things like battery storage to make the grid more reliable, to reduce the amount that renewables have to be switched off. If we're going to keep pushing windfall taxes, they should go onto the generators really, rather than the suppliers, because it's the generators that are making the largest of the profits. Any grant schemes should be extended to other businesses amongst the SME scale, rather than just the very, very large enterprises that are producing things with an awful lot of electricity. That's what can be done fairly quickly, but in the near future, we could potentially split the electricity market between renewable electricity generation, what's called firm power. So firm power includes things like gas, nuclear, and potentially things like pump storage, where it's not reliant on the wind blowing or the sun shining. But the renewables could end up operating in a market separate from that marginal pricing system. So there's a different value placed on firm power versus renewables, perhaps, and then the low cost of renewables could be reflected in what we end up actually paying, rather than being held hostage to the price of gas. Obviously, more and more investment is needed in the transmission, so that constraints are not required as much, and also more renewables can be added and introduced into the grid. And even longer term, full market reform of the electricity market to just completely end the marginal pricing mechanism, which is not fit for purpose anymore, to be perfectly honest. It has been recently killed off in the immediate future, but pricing on differently in different regions of the country might make the regions where they're generating electricity benefit perhaps from lower carbon renewables. It wouldn't necessarily have an across the board benefit, and it might result in some nasty surprises for regions where they're not able to generate as much electricity of their own. There is perhaps some role for hydrogen and nuclear for firm power purposes, but I don't think they should necessarily lead the way, because they are inherently very, very expensive compared to renewables. And of course, we should probably be developing more interconnections with other countries, with other parts of the world, so that we can diversify where electricity comes from, but also we can sell electricity that we're not able to use ourselves, and vice versa, to just make our own grid and the international electricity supply a lot more well balanced. And so, as you can see, a fairly broad, comprehensive set of solutions is probably the answer. And it's going to take a lot of time unless something changes, because it doesn't look like the government's really got a handle on it yet. So I think there's a big element of watch this space. So yeah, I've slightly run over time, but just very briefly to summarize, so why we've got the highest prices. The biggest factor is that gas is setting the price of electricity regardless of how it's generated, at least 97% of the time, due to the marginal pricing mechanism. Policy costs do contribute up to 23% of what we pay for our electricity, but that's loaded onto electricity, whereas it could be loaded onto gas. We have limited storage. There's a limit to how much battery storage we can put onto the grid at the moment, and there's just the fact that we are stuck with the price of gas means that there's huge profits going to some of these big generation companies. But there are solutions that are less likely to work. So increasing our own domestic gas production isn't going to really benefit us, because it's sold on the global market. The price caps alone, at best, they sort of distort the market and change how it looks over time, but doesn't necessarily bring down the wholesale costs long term. Also, scrapping green levies, as we've seen, it's really not going to give us a long-term benefit. Green levies themselves are helping us to switch from an insecure source of electricity, in other words, gas, coming from overseas largely. And then finally, waiting for more, just putting more renewables onto the grid. It's going to take a very, very long time for that to do much until it completely replaces gas. But what would work is changing how the market works, switching green levies from electricity across to gas, and perhaps putting windfall taxes onto generators, and also in the short term supporting broader sections of industry with grants and subsidies. So that brings us to the end. Does anyone have any questions? I know I've run over time slightly, so if there is anything that somebody would like to ask, I don't know if I've got all the answers, but please do put something in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, well, it doesn't look like there's any questions, but if you do think of something, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Send me an email, or give us a phone call, and either myself or my colleagues will be happy to give you our views. But for now, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was it, of interest at least, and maybe there was something new that you didn't realize about how we ended up paying what we pay. Thanks very much. Cheers.